The torn check split the air like a gunshot, ripping through the quiet of the bank lobby, the pieces worth $47,500 a sum that represented pain blood and 3 decades of service fluttering to the cold marble floor like the final fragments of trust. No one had time to breathe. No one had time to understand what had just happened. Only the dry, merciless sound of shredded paper hitting the ground remained. Rebecca Sloan, the head teller of Heritage First Bank, stood still for a moment, then lifted her chin, her gaze sharp and icy, as if she were the judge of this place, deciding who deserved to stand inside its historic doors. "This check is fake. I know exactly the kind of person you are," she declared, her voice slicing through the polished wooden counter like a blade. Around her, customers began raising their phones, fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the awareness that they were witnessing something that should never have been allowed to happen. In the center of the storm, David Coleman stood silently, his hand still slightly extended, as though trying to hold on to something that had just been torn from him. The 52-year-old black man wearing a clean shirt and a faded veteran's cap he had kept for 20 years, said nothing. But his eyes, those eyes carried a pain ordinary people could never comprehend. They were the eyes of a man who had walked battlefields, carried wounded brothers on his shoulders, coughed blood at night because of toxic chemicals, and witnessed things he had sworn no one back home would ever have to endure. And today he was treated like a fraud in the very town he had once protected. Rebecca spoke again, as if savoring the attention of the crowd. "This bank does not process cheap assistance checks for people trying to take advantage of the system. Leave. Now." Her voice sounded controlled, but in truth it shook with arrogance, the kind that grows when someone believes their tiny bit of power gives them the right to step on others. An older woman behind David whispered, "My God, what is she doing?" But no one stepped forward. No one knew what to do when injustice stood exposed in plain sight. In a corner of the lobby, a student named Chloe quietly started live streaming, her fingers gripping her phone tightly. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but because she understood that if no one stood up, at least the truth needed to be seen. A teacher on the left frowned deeply, recognizing every familiar sign of discrimination. Henry Walker, the 60-year-old security guard and fellow veteran, walked forward slowly. He looked at the torn pieces on the floor, then into David's eyes. He needed no explanation. He only needed to observe the posture, the steady calm, the way David kept both hands in front of him, with open palms, the stance of someone trained to maintain control even in chaos. "Do you want me to escort you out?" Henry asked, his voice low. Not a command, but a quiet offering, wrapped in a uniform. David shook his head slowly. No anger, no outburst, only the resolve of a man who had endured enough to know exactly when he must stand his ground. "I just want to deposit my own money," he said. His voice was soft, yet rang through the lobby like the strike of metal. Rebecca laughed. "Your money?" She looked at him as if he were a joke. "You think I would believe that?" Then she stepped on one of the torn pieces, grinding it deeper into the floor. The sight made the blood of many onlookers run cold. A veteran, a man who had once handled explosives, breathed in poisonous smoke, and protected innocent families, was being publicly humiliated by a bank employee in the very town that had once sent him off to war. David looked down at the shredded check, and for the first time, his nose stung, not because of the money, but because of memories. He remembered the night he was carried back to base with seared lungs after clearing a chemical cache. He remembered the gratitude in the eyes of families evacuated to safety. He remembered the silent promise he made that he would return to a country that was fairer and kinder. But today, what did that country give him in return? A tear and humiliation. In Rebecca's mind, there was no guilt, only certainty that she had done the right thing. She scanned the room, waiting for someone to nod in approval. But no one did. Their eyes only grew colder. The air felt heavier, as if the ceiling itself was sinking under the weight of what had just happened. Henry watched his aging eyes narrowing, not out of anger, but out of hurt. Hurt because he saw a man who had bled for this country being treated like he was beneath everyone. Hurt because he remembered standing in that same place many years ago. The crowd remained frozen until a young man whispered, "He doesn't deserve this." For the first time, Rebecca sensed doubt in the room, but arrogance blinded her. She flipped her hair, tilted her head, and said in a cutting voice, "I'll say it one last time. Leave the bank, or I will call the police." Every eye turned toward David, the lone man standing among the silence, and the paper scraps like ashes at his feet. But in that moment, no one knew that in just a few minutes, Rebecca would be the one escorted out of the bank in handcuffs. And today would be the day the man she humiliated would rise and force an entire system to bend to the truth. They simply did not know it yet. But the storm had already begun, and nothing could stop it now. At 5:30 in the morning, the alarm clock shrieked with a sound so familiar David Coleman could hear it even in his sleep. The first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, falling across the small but orderly room, neat as a barracks. David opened his eyes without hesitation, sprang upright like a programmed coil, and placed his feet on the wooden floor without making a single sound. 23 years of military habits lived in every muscle, in the way he folded his bedsheets into sharp corners, in the way he positioned his boots by the door with the toes pointing outward, as if waiting for a command. The little house on the outskirts of Brookfield was still silent. No voices of family, no footsteps, only him. The ticking clock and hundreds of memories scattered through the room. A slightly faded Purple Heart plaque, a sandstorm blurred unit photo, a letter from an old comrade worn at the edges. They did not boast about glory. They simply reminded him each morning that he was still alive. His hands trembled slightly when he reached for the shaving cream, not from age, but from the lingering effects of years spent handling chemical weapons, what doctors called long-term consequences, and what he simply called memories that cling like battlefield dust. He spread the white cream across his face, each movement steady and precise, as if performing a decontamination task. Even the sting of a tiny razor cut brought back the acrid taste of chemicals and the sound of comrades coughing in overheated bunkers. But despite the memories and the ache in his lungs, David still looked into the mirror with the eyes of someone who refused to break. Not proud, not sorrowful, but calm in the way only someone who has walked through hell and returned standing straight can be. He put on a light blue shirt he had ironed the night before, adjusted the collar, then set his worn but clean veteran's cap on his head. The cap was old, the brim slightly frayed, but to him it was a simple badge of honor. He brewed coffee, took a sip, and immediately fell into a fit of coughing. The cough dragged on until he had to brace himself on the counter. When it finally eased, he only gave a tired smile. Another day, he murmured his voice, low and gentle like the morning wind. The Brookfield Times lay neatly on the wooden table. He turned straight to the veterans section, a place rarely filled with good news, yet he read it anyway. a habit, a promise that he would never abandon those who once fought beside him. The answering machine blinked with 3 missed calls from younger veterans asking for advice, asking for help, asking how to navigate the paperwork for VA benefits. David listened to every message and wrote notes in his small, tidy handwriting. "I'll call them after lunch," he thought. No one should get lost in that maze again. As he stepped outside, he closed the door gently, as if not to disturb the fragile peace of his small home. The morning breeze carried the scent of damp leaves and bird song. His 2002 Toyota Camry sat in the driveway, its paint a little faded, its body marked with light scratches, but the engine still ran like a loyal soldier, maintained with the care of a man who once treated every tool like mission equipment. "Still hanging in there, old friend?" he asked quietly. The engine rumbled softly steady and faithful. He drove through the tree-lined streets of Brookfield, a town where everyone knew each other's faces, but few knew the story behind the name David Coleman. At Miller's Diner, the bell jingled lightly as he entered. Older patrons nodded at him. They did not know he once carried dying brothers in his arms. They only knew he was the kind man who restocked the charity shelves every Tuesday and Thursday. "Regular coffee," David Frank, the old cook, called from behind the counter. Like always, David smiled. He paid the exact change, tipped the way he always did, and held the door open for an elderly woman walking in. At the post office, he helped 78-year-old Mrs. Lane lift boxes so heavy her hands shook, just pushing open the door. "Let me help you," he said warmly, never needing thanks. "Thank you, David." Truly, she sighed with relief. He nodded, carrying the humility of someone who had seen far greater suffering than words could describe. At Randolph's market, he let a mother with crying twins go ahead of him, then waved a student with a breakfast sandwich forward. Small things, but together, they formed the image of a man anyone would be grateful to meet, each day someone who made the town kinder just by being in it. But the one person who never saw any of that was Rebecca Sloan. That morning, her brand-new SUV sped past David's old Camry, just as he turned onto the main road. And in that exact moment, the same thought flashed across her mind, the one she always had. People like that. 2 simple words, yet enough to build an entire wall of prejudice in her heart, a wall that would soon set fire to the tragedy waiting that afternoon. David parked in front of Heritage First Bank, turned off the engine, and glanced into the rearview mirror to adjust his cap. He inhaled deeply, as if preparing for an important meeting. Not because he feared anything, but because he respected every step, every procedure, every dollar the government allotted him after years of service. He stepped out his boots, landing firmly on the ground. In his hand was the $47,500 check, not a gift, but proof of what he had sacrificed. He did not know Rebecca was already watching through the glass, her eyes narrowing at the sight of a black man holding a large check. She knew nothing about him, but she believed she knew enough. David pushed the door open. The bell chimed softly. A normal day. A beautiful morning. A good man. And within minutes, everything would be torn apart. Just like that. Check destroyed by a prejudice he had never caused yet would be forced to pay for. He did not know it, but fate already did. And it was waiting for him just behind the teller counter. Heritage First Bank rose before David like a fortress of old money, where polished walnut gleamed so brightly it reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers, and the marble veins running across the floor resembled cold rivers winding through time. The air inside was so still that every footstep echoed clearly, as if this bank only allowed those deemed worthy to leave a mark on its immaculate floors. And David Coleman, with the simple appearance of a man stepping out of an old Camry, was not one of those people, at least not in the eyes of Rebecca Sloane. From behind the glass of her teller window, Rebecca watched him approach. Her lips curled into a half-smirk, half-sneer, her gaze sliding over the faded veteran's cap and the neatly ironed shirt, stiff with crisp lines. Another one from Maple Street, she thought, as if an address alone was enough to map out someone's entire life. No one knew it, but to Rebecca, maintaining standards was not just part of the job, it was her pride. She believed she knew exactly who deserved to walk across this glossy marble and who did not. She trusted her instincts, but those instincts were fed by prejudice, as sweet and poisonous as syrup. David approached her counter, simply because it had the shortest line. He knew nothing about her reputation, the way she sent customers away with a sting in their chest, or how people whispered to avoid counter number 3 if they wanted a peaceful afternoon. He just wanted to finish his deposit and get home to call the younger veterans who needed his help. When David offered a polite greeting, Rebecca barely glanced up and asked in a voice cold enough to freeze behind the glass, "What do you need?" The question was neutral in wording, but the weight she put on the word "you" dropped like a stone, as if she were speaking to a problem, not a person. David placed the check on the counter, along with his identification. "I'd like to deposit this compensation payment into my account." His tone was simple, with no defensiveness, no bragging, no attempt to prove anything. But with just one glance, Rebecca saw only one thing: $47,500. She narrowed her eyes. Her lips curling in that familiar shape of suspicion she convinced herself was professionalism. "This amount does not match your profile." The words tightened around David's throat, not because he felt guilty, but because he had heard this sentence all his life from places meant to protect him, and from places that never cared. Rebecca delivered the line, openly looking at him, as if he were an incorrect equation, as if the story of his life did not add up. "Where did you get this money?" Her voice sharpened a little louder than necessary, drawing the attention of people across the lobby. David remained calm. "From the Department of Veterans Affairs, ma'am. This is a compensation." "Compensation," Rebecca cut him off with a raised chin, as if the word itself were extravagant. "I've heard that excuse plenty of times. People always use the military to fool others." A cold breath crawled up David's spine, but he still did not react in anger. His eyes dropped to the check, not in shame, but in sorrow. Not sorrow for the money, but for the reality that someone could look at a piece of paper before looking at a human being. At the far end of the lobby, Mrs. Margaret Ellis, who often saw David at the food bank, immediately recognized that painfully polite expression on his face. She narrowed her eyes at Rebecca, sensing something very wrong. But Rebecca saw no one except her own reflection in the glass, the reflection of someone she imagined to be the guardian of the bank, not the person standing right in front of her. "I need to investigate further," Rebecca said, her voice heavy with authority. "This amount is extremely suspicious. You can call the Veterans Affairs office," David offered gently. "Or verify it through the Treasury system. I don't need anyone teaching me how to do my job." Rebecca flicked her nail against the counter, producing a sharp sound like a whip crack. Customers nearby turned their heads, curiosity flickering in their eyes, some from the spectacle, others from the unmistakable rise of injustice. In that moment, Rebecca picked up the check with only the tips of her fingers as if handling something filthy. This amount is inconsistent. The issuing agency is questionable. And more importantly, her gaze scanned him from top to bottom, pausing at the veteran's cap, the simple shirt, the worn shoes. You do not look like someone who would receive a compensation payment this large, a strike straight to David's heart. Not because the words were new, but because they came from a place meant to be neutral, a bank, an institution built on trust. He did not lash out. He simply stood straighter, his shoulders trembling slightly as he inhaled to hold on to the last thread of composure. In the far left corner, Professor Brooks, stood up phone, raised his expression, hardening. This is clear discrimination, he muttered more to himself than to anyone else, but with every intention of recording everything. Chloe had already started live streaming, her eyes wide with shock, not because the scene was unbelievable, but because it was painfully familiar. God, not again, she whispered into her phone. But Rebecca had not finished. She slammed the keys on her keyboard, then looked up with a judge's voice announcing, "I do not accept this check." And then, as if ending a performance, she tore it in half. No hesitation, no thought. The sound cracked through the bank lobby like the first gunshot of a tragedy about to unfold. David felt the floor tilt beneath him for a split second. His body did not move, but his heart took the blow as if someone had struck him with both fists. The tearing sound felt like skin ripping, like the dragging footsteps of soldiers pulling comrades out of toxic zones. And in his mind, one slow question echoed. Why are they doing this to me? But the answer stood right in front of him, and it had a name. Rebecca Sloan. A woman who believed she was protecting the bank, but was in fact destroying a man with the very prejudices she had nurtured for years. The pieces of the check hit the floor. Everyone stopped breathing. And David, a man who had survived poison and war, felt a kind of pain he never expected. Not from a distant battlefield, but from the battlefield standing right in front of him in his own hometown. And he did not yet know that this moment would ignite the fire that would burn through an entire system. But fate knew. The whole bank knew. And the storm was coming faster than any of them imagined. The sound of the check being torn in half cut through the quiet Brookfield afternoon, like the sky itself had been ripped open, sharp and cold enough to make the people nearby flinch. The paper that represented 23 years of service, the lingering wounds of chemical exposure, the countless nights David Coleman coughed in the dark, now lay scattered at Rebecca Sloan's feet like worthless trash. She looked at the pieces with the expression of someone who believed she had just done something clever, lifting her chin with the smug satisfaction only those living inside a bubble of privilege could wear. Now you can't take this pile of fake paper anywhere else to fool people, Rebecca said, her voice ringing through the bank's grand lobby. Every word she spoke was sharp as steel, freezing the air even further. David stood motionless. Not because the money was gone, not because the crowd watched him as if he were a slow-motion scene in a film, but because what had just been shredded under her shoes wasn't a check but the trust he had placed in this country, in places he once believed were safe. His chest tightened, as if those torn pieces were being ripped straight from his heart. Images from the battlefield surged up in his mind, the nights he was dragged out of contaminated zones, the blaring alarms, the ragged breaths, the desperate voices of comrades pleading, "Stay awake, Dave." All of it collided with this moment, humiliation arriving once more, but in a deeper, quieter, more devastating way. Behind him, Margaret Ellis raised a trembling hand over her mouth and choked out, "Dear God, that girl has lost her mind." But still, no one dared step forward. Injustice, when it happens, has a way of freezing people before they know what to do. David slowly lowered his gaze to the shredded pieces at his feet. He did not kneel. He did not pick them up. He did not beg. He simply looked at them with an expression that could silence a room if anyone bothered to notice. But Rebecca didn't. She was too busy adjusting her blazer collar and turning toward Henry the security guard to command escort this man out of the bank. Immediately. Henry, 57 years old, silver-haired, limping slightly from an old injury, stood frozen in place. He looked at David, then at Rebecca, then at the torn pieces on the floor. And in that moment, a sorrow flickered in his eyes, the kind only those who once wore a uniform could understand. "Miss Sloane," his voice was slow, cautious. "I think we should—" "There is no thinking." Rebecca snapped her tone, cracking like shattering glass. "You're hired to keep security, not to question me. Remove him. He is causing a disturbance. Causing a disturbance." The words made David want to laugh, a bitter laugh with no humor at all. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't slammed a counter, hadn't crossed the red line in front of the teller stations. He had only stood there, insulted. His dignity, attacked, his property destroyed. Yet now he was being labeled the problem. A label he knew far too well from his younger years. Henry approached, wearing an expression of deep conflict. He straightened his posture and said softly, "Brother, I don't want to do this." David met his eyes, and in a single second, both men understood each other in the unspoken language of those who had served respect. Instead of stepping back, David turned to face Rebecca directly. His voice dropped low, steady, and so calm that several people nearby shivered. "You have just destroyed a federal financial instrument without any verification," he said. "I am requesting to speak with your manager." Rebecca burst into laughter, loud and sharp like a blade striking stone dripping with ridicule. "The manager is out to lunch, and even if he were here, he would say exactly what I'm saying. The check is fake. Your story is fake. Everything about you is unreliable." David heard every word, but what hurt was not the insult itself. It was the blind arrogance behind her voice, the absolute confidence in her own prejudice. The air in the bank shifted. The person recording the live stream moved closer. Professor Brooks stepped forward, raising his phone higher. Several customers whispered, "She's wrong. This is unbelievable. He's a veteran." But Rebecca believed the crowd was on her side. She lifted her chin, speaking louder, emphasizing each word as if delivering a final verdict. "This check is fake. I don't need to verify it. I know this type of person. This type of person." The phrase dropped onto the floor like a knife. Chloe, the student live streaming, tightened her grip until her knuckles turned white. "Oh my God," she whispered into the camera. Did she really just say that? Before anyone could react, Rebecca bent down, picked up the remaining half of the check and tore it again. This time she ripped it slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone heard. David's face twitched not from the loss of money, but from the cruelty laid bare. Each tear sounded like a crack in his chest, like the tap of a rifle butt against armored steel in a sandstorm night, like the fading beep of a comrade's heart monitor long ago. Yet David didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist. He didn't step back. Instead, he said one sentence, a sentence that shifted the air in the bank like wind rippling across a frozen lake. "You have made a serious mistake." Rebecca scoffed. You made the mistake by walking in here." Henry closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if sensing the real storm approaching. He couldn't stop it. No one could. David slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Rebecca smirked. "Oh, calling your lawyer now, I'd love to see this." But David did not dial a lawyer. The moment he touched the screen, Professor Brooks whispered, "Oh, he's really doing it." Chloe raised her phone higher. Her live stream viewer count shot into the hundreds. David lifted the phone to his ear. His voice didn't shake. It was not angry. It was solid as steel. "I need to report the destruction of a financial instrument issued by the Department of the Treasury. Serial number 47291B. Location Heritage. First Bank, Brookfield." There was a 2-second silence. Then the voice on the other end shifted instantly. Rebecca heard it, and the color drained from her face. The storm had arrived, and this time it would spare no one. The voice on the other end of the line came through sharp and clear, so cold and professional that the entire bank lobby seemed to tighten as if caught in an invisible fist. "Did you just say, Treasury check 47291B has been destroyed?" The tone of the Treasury duty officer shifted instantly, no longer the standard politeness of a call center representative, but the urgent voice of someone who had just heard a keyword capable of triggering a federal investigation. David stood still, eyes fixed on Rebecca, as though every word he spoke was becoming part of the sentence for the woman who had shredded his dignity. "Yes," he replied, his voice so steady that the people standing closest to him felt a chill run down their spine. The bank employee destroyed the check without performing any verification whatsoever. The other end of the line fell silent for half a second. Then the Treasury officer's voice returned sharp as metal. "Mr. Coleman, please confirm. This is a compensation check issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs, correct? In the amount of $47,500, correct?" Silence followed, the kind of silence that made Rebecca Sloan feel her throat suddenly dry like sand. She looked around the room, searching for someone's approval, some supportive glance, but all she found were wide eyes, tense faces, and phones raised even higher. She swallowed hard, but her breath caught in her throat. On the phone, the Treasury officer's voice shifted again, now urgent. "Mr. Coleman, listen carefully. The destruction of a federal financial instrument is a serious offense under Title 18 United States Code, Section 510. We are dispatching agents to your location immediately. Please secure the scene and ensure all witnesses remain available." The voice was loud enough for the line of customers to hear. Someone exhaled sharply. Another whispered, "Oh my God, this is real." Rebecca's face drained of color. She stumbled back half a step, as if the floor had suddenly dropped beneath her. "Agents," she stammered. "Wait, that was just..." But the excuse died in her throat. David's phone lit up again as the Treasury officer continued. "Please state the name of the employee who destroyed the check." David didn't look at the phone. He looked directly at Rebecca, not with hatred, not with vengeance, but with the quiet pain and unwavering resolve of a man who had faced death, yet never been treated like garbage until today. "The person who destroyed it is Rebecca Sloan," he said, his voice ringing through the lobby like a bell. A wave of murmurs rolled across the bank. Chloe clutched her phone, whispering to her live stream audience. "My God, thousands of people are watching this." "She's finished." At the far end of the lobby, Professor Brooks shook his head, his voice trembling with anger as he spoke into his camera. "She has no idea what she's done." Meanwhile, Rebecca felt her legs go cold. She looked desperately toward Henry, the security guard, but met only the harsh gaze of truth, the look of a veteran who had seen too much injustice to pretend this wasn't happening. Henry said nothing, but his eyes said everything. "You touched something no one is allowed to touch." Rebecca tried to regain her voice, but it shattered like glass, just like the check at her feet. He's lying. The check was fake. I was only doing my job." David ended the call and lowered the phone. His voice was soft, but everyone heard each word as clearly as metal striking ice. "You did not verify it. Not a single step." A customer behind him spoke up. "I saw everything." "She didn't check anything," another added. "She took one look at him and decided everything." Rebecca spun toward the voices, her face flushing red from a mix of shame and panic. "You don't understand. I was protecting the bank from fraud by destroying federal documents," someone called out. "Nobody does that." Rebecca bit her lip until it drew blood. For the first time, she realized far too late that she had stepped on something she had no right to touch, federal law. But her nightmare was only beginning. The bank phone rang like an alarm. Linda Park, the assistant manager, grabbed it in a panic. After only a few seconds, her face drained completely. "Yes, I understand. I will handle it right away." Linda hung up and faced Rebecca, her voice shaking. "The Federal Treasury and corporate headquarters have both received the complaint. They said agents are on their way here." Rebecca opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She stepped back again, bumping into the counter, sending papers scattering to the floor. The shredded check pieces stuck to her shoe like evidence she could never escape. Chloe whispered into her live stream. 6,000 people watching. 10,000. Oh my God. Henry stepped closer to David, his voice low with respect. "Your military combat engineer," David answered. 3 deployments in the Middle East. Chemical damage to the lungs." Henry's shoulders slumped as he nodded, his eyes growing wet. "I served in Germany. It's an honor to meet you." Everyone who heard understood instantly this man was not a troublemaker. He was someone who had carried this country's wounds on his own body. Rebecca heard it, and finally she understood. But far too late. The sound of sirens echoed from outside. 3 black SUVs pulled into the bank's parking lot. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. A customer whispered, "They're here." And in that exact moment, Rebecca Sloan, who once felt powerful behind the teller counter, suddenly felt herself becoming small enough to disappear. Because the glass doors of Heritage First Bank were opening, and the people walking in weren't here to protect her. No one was here to stand with her. They had come to end what she started with a single tear. And everyone understood. This moment would be remembered in Brookfield for years to come. The glass doors of Heritage First Bank swung open with a sharp, decisive crack loud enough to make the people standing nearest instinctively step back. 3 federal agents in black suits entered, moving with the precision of individuals long accustomed to operating in the most high-pressure situations. Leading them was Agent Patricia Monroe, 43 years old. Her eyes cold and sharp as a blade, her posture straight every step, radiating an authority that required no introduction. Behind her was Agent Daniel Ruiz, 41, holding a tablet displaying the digital file of the destroyed check. The customers in the lobby froze. Phones that had been recording suddenly became still, as though even technology understood it was time to make room for the invisible force that had just entered the room. Rebecca Sloan stood behind the teller counter, looking as if the blood had been drained from her body, her face pale as paper. She tried to stand straight, but her legs shook so hard that her heels slid slightly on the polished floor. When Agent Monroe moved closer, Rebecca involuntarily stepped back, her mouth opening without a single sound coming out. At that moment, David Coleman remained still, not stepping forward, not stepping back, only watching with the calm of someone who had experienced the moment when a superior walked in, and a fate was sealed. "Who destroyed the treasury check in this location?" Agent Monroe asked, her voice low, but echoing across the lobby, each word sounding as though it had been carved from metal. Linda Park, the assistant manager, swallowed hard, then lifted her hand and pointed at Rebecca with the instinctive self-preservation of someone standing on the edge of a cliff. She tore it up in front of everyone. The statement snapped something inside Rebecca, and she burst out immediately. "Wait, that was... I thought it was fake." "You thought," Agent Ruiz repeated, emphasizing the two words as if hammering nails into a door that would never open again. He raised the tablet, showing an enlarged image of the check before it was torn down to the embossed ink details. "Treasury check 47291B, legally issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Amount $47,500. Compensation for toxic chemical exposure during wartime service." A choked gasp came from a customer. Margaret Ellis clutched her chest, tears rising as she heard Agent Ruiz continue reading. "Recipient Staff Sergeant David Coleman, combat engineer, 3 deployments in the Middle East, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, chemical weapons disposal exposure, confirmed ongoing respiratory complications." Rebecca swayed like someone whose illusions had just been shattered. Every excuse she had rehearsed died in her throat. She no longer tried to defend herself. She only stared at the torn pieces at her feet with pure, unfiltered terror. The moment she tore the check believing she was doing the right thing, now spun back toward her like a blade cutting her own hands. "Miss Sloane, Agent Monroe," said, stepping closer, her voice solemn and final, like a judge bringing down the gavel. "Destroying a federal financial instrument is a criminal offense subject to prosecution. You are not authorized to declare fraud without conducting any verification. This is a violation not only of bank policy, but of federal law." Rebecca tried to speak, but Agent Monroe did not give her the chance. "You acted based on prejudice, not evidence." The crowd held its breath. Chloe, still live-streaming, whispered, "She's about to be handcuffed." Rebecca turned toward David, her eyes wild with panic like someone drowning and reaching for the last piece of floating wood. I didn't know. I didn't know you were a veteran." "I didn't." David looked at her, his eyes neither angry nor vengeful, only sad. A sadness so deep it made several people look away. He answered quietly, almost like speaking to himself. "You didn't need to know. You only needed to show respect." His words fell like the first cold rain after a long drought, clear, sharp, and unbearably painful. Agent Monroe shifted her attention to Henry Walker. "You witnessed this?" Henry straightened, and the soldier in him resurfaced instantly. "Yes." "She tore it right in front of all of us. No checking, no questions, nothing but insults toward him." The testimony fell like the final hammer strike. Agent Ruiz nodded and logged every detail. Then Agent Monroe spoke the sentence the entire bank had been waiting for. "Rebecca Sloane, you are under arrest for destruction of a federal financial instrument and potential violation of a citizen's civil rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be used against you in federal court." The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the lobby, sharp, cold, and symbolic. Rebecca collapsed into tears, her arrogance gone, her authority gone. All that remained was the wreckage. The shredded paper at her feet, what she had dismissed as fake, had now become undeniable evidence of a crime she could never erase. No, I didn't mean to. I didn't. But Agent Ruiz tightened the cuffs slightly, cutting off her excuses. Save your explanations for the court. As the agents led Rebecca away, the entire bank fell silent. No one celebrated. No one cheered. They simply watched, absorbing a brutal lesson. Prejudice can destroy a life, but justice can destroy prejudice in a matter of minutes. Linda Park turned to David, her voice trembling. I am deeply sorry, Mr. Coleman. We will report everything. David gave a small nod. He did not need the bank's apology. He only needed the truth to be seen. Henry placed a hand on David's shoulder, gripping firmly, his eyes shining. Thank you for serving this country, and thank you for standing firm in the face of this injustice. When David looked toward the bank's entrance, where Rebecca was being led out in trembling defeat, he did not feel victory. He felt a deep, persistent ache, as if an old wound inside him had just been pressed once more. But he also felt something else, the subtle shift of fate's gears beginning to turn. A storm had arrived, and no one in that bank would remain untouched. An investigation was coming. A chain of consequences was already unfolding, and everything was only just beginning. Right after Rebecca Sloane was escorted out of the bank, Heritage First Bank fell into a dense, suffocating silence, as if all the air had been vacuumed out of the room. The footsteps of the federal agents still echoed through the hallway, but to everyone left standing, that sound felt like justice pounding on every door, every teller station, every hidden vein of the financial system they had once believed was unshakable for decades. David Coleman stood still for a moment, his hand unconsciously resting on the place where his Purple Heart once sat. His eyes neither proud nor angry, just still, like a lake, disturbed by a stone whose ripples go so deep no one can see the bottom. Another federal agent entered a field agent, assigned to collect physical evidence. He opened a sealed evidence kit and carefully gathered each torn piece of the check into a bag, lifting them as if collecting dust from a battlefield. Linda Park watched her face, pale, her shaking hands clasped together, as everything she once believed about her traditional, proper, trustworthy bank crumbled in front of her. When the agents requested the security footage, Linda scrambled to her computer, typing so frantically she entered the wrong password twice. Agent Ruiz stood right behind her, his gaze sharp enough to cut through the polished wood and the bank's long, self-important history. We need all camera footage from 9 in the morning until now. No edits, no cuts, no deletions, he said, calm but issuing an order that allowed no argument. Linda nodded, sweating. Of course, a customer nearby whispered, "This whole branch is finished." In the corners of the lobby, the sounds of recording and live streaming picked up again. Chloe's viewer count had surged past 40,000, the comment stream rushing like a waterfall. Arrest the right person. This is blatant racial discrimination. Protect that man. The entire bank corporation must answer for this. David heard the commotion behind him, but he didn't turn around. He stood facing the truth. A system he once trusted was now exposing its cracks that had existed for years. Cracks that Rebecca's actions had merely pierced through the final layer of. Henry Walker moved beside him, standing shoulder to shoulder like two soldiers bracing for incoming fire. "You know," Henry said quietly, "this isn't the first time I saw her treat a black customer poorly. But it's the first time someone stood firm like you did." David looked at him, his eyes deep and heavy, carrying both the memories of a battlefield and the fresh wound of being humiliated in the very land he had protected. "I didn't stand to prove anything," he replied. "I stood because I had no choice left." The words hit Henry hard, because he understood that feeling too well. The doors of the bank opened again, this time revealing an FBI agent from the Civil Rights Division, Agent Karen Lopez, 39. Hair tied tightly, eyes sharp, like someone who had read too many reports on racial discrimination and had long lost patience for excuses. "We received a coordination request from the Department of the Treasury," she announced, flashing her FBI credentials. "There is evidence of discriminatory conduct in a financial transaction. From this moment forward, this entire branch is under federal investigation." The lobby erupted into tense whispers. A young teller nearly dropped a stack of files. Linda Park looked so shocked she had to grip the desk to steady herself. And David remained still, a silent witness to history, rewriting itself in real time. Agent Lopez deployed her team. They set up data analysis equipment, demanded transaction logs, and began taking statements from every customer present. A stream of paperwork spilled from the printers, daily transaction lists, logs of rejected checks, lists of clients flagged as risk. And then the truth began to surface. A young employee, pale as chalk, placed a folder in front of Lopez, his voice shaking. And in the last 3 years, he stammered, customers who are black have been asked for additional verification more than 4 times as often. 4 times, Lopez repeated, her voice flat and icy. Latino clients. He swallowed. More than 3 times. Asian clients. 2.5. The lobby plunged into a knife-sharp silence. It was the silence of truth, laid bare with no escape, no excuse left standing. Lopez took notes, her eyes never leaving the chart. "This is not an individual mistake," she said. "This is a pattern of systemic discrimination." Linda Park's face turned ghost white. No, we didn't intentionally. We just followed the procedures." Procedures designed by whom, Lopez asked. Linda had no answer. Henry stepped forward, his voice as deep as an echo from the past. "I told the previous manager many times. Rebecca treated people of color differently from white customers. I saw it. But he told me, don't make trouble." That statement cut through the last curtain, hiding the truth. Lopez recorded it instantly. David heard every word, feeling his chest tighten. He realized that what happened to him today was not an accident. It was only the tip of a massive iceberg beneath the surface. Dozens of customers began speaking. A middle-aged man described being stopped because his signature didn't look like a high-income earner's. A young woman recalled being interrogated for withdrawing a large amount of cash. An elderly man shared how his check had been rejected simply because he lived in a high-risk neighborhood. As testimony poured out like a flood, breaking through a dam, David felt his own chest ache. Each story was another reopened wound, and all of them shared one truth: none of these people had ever been listened to. Until today. Then the doors opened once more. This time it was Branch Director Robert Hastings, rushing in as pale as Linda had been earlier. When he saw 3 federal agents, the FBI, and more than 30 phones recording him, he froze. Agent Monroe looked at him, the way one might look at a file that had just stepped out of its folder on its own. "Are you the individual responsible for managing this branch?" Hastings swallowed and attempted to steady his voice. "Yes, but this is only a misunderstanding." Lopez cut him off, her tone slicing through the air like a blade. "Not a misunderstanding. Evidence indicates a pattern of systemic racial discrimination. Your operational procedures violate federal civil rights law. We will investigate 5 full years of activity. Everything will be forwarded to the Department of Justice. If violations are found, the parent corporation will be held accountable. Hastings nearly lost his balance, gripping the counter for support. Those words landed like blocks of ice. At that moment, David understood this had grown far beyond the actions of one unethical employee. This was the death knell of an entire way of operating. Agent Monroe then turned to him, her gaze softening just slightly. "Mr. Coleman, we want to ensure you are treated appropriately as the victim of a federal offense. We will take everything from here." David nodded. Not proud, not relieved, just carrying the calm of someone who had walked a long road to finally see justice begin to unfold. The entire lobby remained silent, because everyone knew from this moment forward nothing would ever return to the way it was. And David Coleman, the man dismissed just hours earlier, had now become the light, exposing the deepest layers of a system no one dared to question. The investigation had begun, and nothing could stop it now. 3 weeks after the incident, the federal courthouse in Columbus was packed, to the point it felt as if the entire state of Ohio had gathered to witness a historic moment. The courthouse grounds swarmed with reporters, news vans and banners demanding justice for a veteran. People were not there because of a torn check. They were there because of a brutal truth. A system of power had treated a man who once defended his country as if he were a criminal. The courtroom was thick with tension. Rebecca Sloan sat at the defendant's table in a wrinkled orange jumpsuit, her hair tied back hastily, her face gaunt, as though she had endured 3 years of confinement instead of 3 weeks. The arrogance she once displayed behind the teller counter was gone. The false confidence that made her believe she had the right to judge others had shattered just like the check she tore that day. Across the room, David Coleman entered, wearing his formal military uniform. The lights of the courtroom reflected off the medals on his chest, the Purple Heart glimmering the bronze star, casting a solemn glow of sacrifice. He walked slowly, not to make a scene, but because his body had grown accustomed to that pace after years of damage from chemical exposure. Every breath he took carried a quiet reminder of the price he had paid for his life. Cameras outside continued rolling. The audience inside held their breath. And among them all, David stood like a living landmark in history, impossible to look away from. When Judge Evelyn Ramirez entered her gavel, struck like thunder in a clear sky, the United States Court convenes to try the defendant Rebecca Sloan on charges of destruction of a federal financial instrument, violation of a citizen's civil rights, and discriminatory conduct in financial services. Her voice rang firm, making Rebecca flinch. Prosecutor Janet Collins' red hair pulled back neatly, eyes sharp enough to cut through deception, stepped forward. She did not begin by attacking the defendant. She began by looking at David, then at the entire courtroom, as if reminding them that truth never disappears. It simply waits for its moment to rise. "Your Honor, Janet," began today, "we are not merely trying a bank teller. Today we are confronting a system far more dangerous than any counterfeit. Check a system of prejudice rooted in a financial institution, a system that destroyed the dignity of a man who gave his life to protect this nation." She presented the evidence, a live stream with over 50 million views, security footage, 5 years of data, showing that black customers were scrutinized 400% more often, testimony from Henry Walker, and statements from numerous customers who had been treated unfairly. Rebecca bowed her head, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. Every word she once used to humiliate David had now become evidence against her. But the turning point was not in the data. It was in the moment Janet called the most important witness. The court calls Staff Sergeant David Coleman. David rose his chest, lifting slowly, and walked to the witness stand. The entire room went silent, as though even a breath too loud might break the gravity of the moment. He placed his hand on the stand, his voice deep and warm, yet carrying something cracked beneath the surface. "I served 23 years in the United States Army," he began. "I walked through deserts filled with toxic chemicals. I carried dying comrades in my arms. I believed that when I returned home, at the very least I would be treated like a human being, not with privilege, just with respect." A few people in the courtroom covered their mouths to hold back sobs. David continued, his voice steady, but heavy like desert wind. "But at that bank, they did not look at me as a person. They did not ask if my lungs hurt, if I could sleep, if the nightmares ever stopped. They looked at me and asked, with their eyes, 'Why would someone like you have this amount of money?'" Rebecca burst into tears, but no one reached out to comfort her. No one saw her as a victim anymore. David spoke again, his voice dropping even lower, intensifying the silence. "I did not go to the bank to prove I was a hero. I went to deposit my money I earned at the cost of my health, my rest and nights of coughing up blood." He placed his hand over his chest, where his Purple Heart once rested. But the deepest wound that day was not the torn check. It was being treated like a liar on the very soil I sacrificed myself to protect. A sob broke from someone in the audience. Janet stepped forward, her voice sharp as a blade. The defendant's actions dishonored a citizen, a veteran, and revealed a pattern of systemic racial discrimination. The court must send a clear message in the United States financial system: no one is allowed to trample human dignity. When it was time for the defense, Rebecca's lawyer stammered. "My client made a momentary mistake. She did not intend. She thought Judge Ramirez cut him off." Miss Sloane did not think. She judged. The words nailed themselves into the air. Finally, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a decision that carried no hesitation. Guilty on all counts. Rebecca broke down in tears, but no eyes in the courtroom softened for her. When Judge Ramirez delivered the sentence, her voice sounded like the final thunder of a storm. The defendant, Rebecca Sloane, is sentenced to 24 months in federal prison, $75,000 in fines, 1,000 hours of community service at a veterans organization, and permanent disqualification from any financial service occupation. The sentence fell like a stone, sealing off a dark chapter. But when David stepped down and began to leave the courtroom, everyone inside rose to their feet, not in celebration, but in respect. He did not smile. He simply bowed his head slightly, as if to say that today's justice was not a personal victory, but a victory for the act of standing up. And in that moment, every person present, whether reporter, court employee, or passerby, understood something profound. A torn check had triggered a trial that changed an entire industry, and the story of one man had awakened an entire system. This was only the beginning. After the federal trial that shook the state of Ohio, David Coleman's story spread faster than any news report. Major media outlets covered it simultaneously, from the Washington Post to CNN and MSNBC, while social media exploded with millions of shares, turning the incident in Brookfield into a national symbol of standing up against discrimination. The Department of Justice expanded the investigation, ordering Heritage First Bank to review its entire 5-year system and uncovering more than 20 additional cases where minority customers had been treated unfairly. A report more than 100 pages long was released, exposing a pattern of systemic racial discrimination that people had once referred to simply as procedure. Congress held a hearing and invited David to speak. He appeared in full dress uniform, recounting the story, not to accuse, but to remind everyone that respect must never be a privilege. His testimony brought the Chamber of Senators to complete silence, followed by a standing ovation that lasted long and loud. Major banks across the country immediately launched reforms, bias detection systems in transactions, fair practice, monitoring protocols, mandatory training programs for every employee. The media called it the Coleman effect. But David didn't seek recognition. He used his civil settlement to establish the Coleman Justice Fund, offering legal support to victims of discrimination in the financial sector. Within just 3 months, hundreds of people sought help. David was always the one opening the door for them, his voice gentle like a morning breeze, yet filled with steady resolve. He did not see himself as the founder of a movement, only as someone who lit a lantern for those who had been forced to live in the dark for far too long. And once that light began to spread, the entire nation started to change. 1 year after the check was torn at Rebecca Sloan's feet, Brookfield had changed so deeply that even its own residents felt as if they were walking through a new town. Heritage First Bank, the place once shaken by scandal, now displayed a golden plaque in its main lobby, engraved with the words, "Respect every customer. Serve with honor and fairness." A framed photograph of David Coleman in his military dress uniform stood proudly at the center of the lobby, accompanied by handwritten letters of gratitude from hundreds of customers. The new branch director, Maria Santos, a former Navy officer, transformed the branch into the most diverse workplace in the region, where employees of many ethnicities and languages blended together like a warm, harmonious melody. But what changed people the most was not the plaques or the training sessions. It was the sight of David Coleman still waking up at 5:30 every morning, still driving his old Camry, still unlocking the small office of the Coleman Justice Fund, where he spent hour after hour helping veterans denied their benefits, families mistreated by banks, and quiet wounded individuals who had suffered the same injustices he once endured. When he walked through the doors of the old bank 1 year later, everyone stood up, all rising at once and bowing their heads in respect. Henry Walker, his hair even grayer, but his smile just as warm, said to him, "You didn't just change this bank, you changed all of us." David only gave a small, gentle smile. He did not seek praise. He only hoped for one thing, that no one else would ever have to stand alone in the face of injustice the way he once did. And as he stepped out of the bank, the morning sunlight fell across his shoulders, light, warm, and full of hope, like a quiet promise that the journey he began with a torn check had become a guiding flame for thousands of others seeking to reclaim their dignity. From the perspective of an expert in ethics and systems, David Coleman's story proves that injustice does not always come from grand acts. Sometimes it begins with a glance, a prejudice, a small gesture that carries the power to destroy a person's dignity. And it is the way one individual chooses to stand up and confront wrongdoing that forces an entire system to reflect on itself. Justice does not arrive on its own. It is created through the courage of ordinary people, like David. If this story resonates with you, make sure to like and subscribe. so we can continue sharing the values that matter. And before you leave the video, drop a short comment, a simple 3-word reminder of today's lesson: honor every person.